What happens internally when an empath is hurt repeatedly isn't just sadness or exhaustion. It's a secret psychological transformation so profound that the person who emerges on the other side barely resembles who they used to be. And understanding it will permanently change how you see both yourself and the people you love most. Have you ever looked in the mirror one day and felt like a stranger was staring back at you? Like somewhere between all the people you poured yourself into and all the times you gave more than you had, someone quieter and harder started showing up inside you. If you've ever felt your warmth toward others slowly cool without knowing why, or if you've caught yourself going through the motions of caring when the feeling just wasn't there anymore, you already know what we're talking about today. But knowing the feeling and understanding what is actually driving it are two very different things. So let's talk about what is really going on under the surface. Because this transformation is not what most people think it is. Here is the part that might be hard to hear. The change that happens inside an empath after repeated hurt is not simply them toughening up. It is not them becoming cold or indifferent. And it is definitely not them losing their capacity to feel. What actually happens goes far deeper than any of those surface descriptions. There is a psychological shift that takes place, one that reshapes how that person relates to the world around them, how much of themselves they choose to show, and most importantly, how they decide to use their own emotional energy going forward. That shift has been observed by psychologists and researchers across generations. And once you understand it, you will never look at an empath the same way again. Let's start at the beginning, because to understand the transformation, you first need to understand what being an empath actually costs. Most people think empaths are simply really sensitive, like they cry at movies more than other people do, or they feel sad when someone else is upset. And while that is technically true, it doesn't even come close to capturing what is actually happening inside an empath on a daily basis. An empath doesn't just notice the emotions of others, they absorb them. When someone near them is in pain, an empath doesn't just see it or recognize it, they feel it as if it were happening in their own body. Research into empathy suggests that some people have a more highly reactive mirror neuron system, meaning the part of the brain that maps other people's emotions fires much more intensely in them than in the average person. It is not quite identical to experiencing the pain yourself, but for many empaths, it can feel that way. And that distinction matters. Think about what that means for a moment. Think about what it would be like to walk through a single day, carrying not just your own feelings, but fragments of the emotional weight of everyone around you. Your co-workers' stress, your friends' loneliness, your partner's frustration, all of it landing on you, filtering through you, leaving traces in you that take time and solitude to process. Now think about doing that every single day for years with little to no recovery time. Because that is exactly what many empaths do. They give and absorb and hold space and comfort and repeat over and over, often without anyone returning that same energy back to them. That right there is the setup. That constant outward flow of emotional energy with not enough coming back in creates a very specific kind of exhaustion. Psychologists have a name for this stage: compassion fatigue. It is a recognized condition where the brain, after too long spent absorbing the distress of others, begins to lose its ability to keep responding. And that fatigue, when it goes on long enough, when it gets deep enough, triggers something fundamental inside the empath. Something that was never meant to be triggered, but something that is absolutely necessary for survival. But here is the piece that most people never consider, and it reframes the entire transformation. What if the emotional energy an empath keeps pouring outward never actually disappears when it stops flowing? What if it goes somewhere else entirely? In psychological terms, there is a useful framework that comes from early research into how the mind manages its inner resources. It is the concept of psychic energy, And before you picture anything mystical, let me be clear about what this actually means. Think of it as your mental and emotional bandwidth, the finite amount of attention and feeling your brain can direct outward before it starts pulling back towards self-preservation. It is not a literal liquid in your body. It is a way of describing where your focus and emotional capacity go. And for an empath, that bandwidth naturally flows outward by default. They send it toward others like a river running downhill. They pour it into relationships, into understanding, into fixing, into feeling alongside the people they love. But here is what happens when that energy keeps flowing outward and nothing is coming back. The system begins to compensate. It begins to redirect. Like a river that has been drained at the mouth and has nowhere left to go, the energy starts to turn inward. It starts to accumulate inside the empath rather than flowing out. And when it does, it begins to power something else entirely. It begins to power a deeper relationship with the self. This is not a conscious decision the empath makes. It is not them sitting down one day and saying, "You know what? I am going to start focusing on myself now." It happens slowly, underneath the surface, long before the empath is even aware of it. The internal world becomes richer, more complex, more interesting than the external world that has caused so much pain. Thoughts become more layered. Self-reflection becomes more natural. The empath starts spending more time inside their own head, not because they want to shut the world out, but because their inner world has become a genuinely safer and more rewarding place to exist. And this is where the transformation begins to take visible shape. Consider a case profile, a composite illustration based on observed psychological patterns, of someone we'll call A. A is a woman in her late 20s who has spent most of her adult life being the person everyone else calls when things fall apart. She is the one who listens for hours, who shows up with food and comfort and the right words. She has never really thought about why she does it. It just feels natural. It feels like the most obvious thing in the world to be there for the people she loves. But there is a pattern in A's life that she has not yet seen clearly. The people she gives the most to tend to give back the least. Her closest relationships are deeply imbalanced. She absorbs their pain. She holds their secrets. She sacrifices her own needs to keep the peace. Psychologists call this pattern introjection, which is essentially the tendency to take in the emotions and experiences of others and carry them internally as if they were your own. For A, it has been so automatic for so long that she has never thought to question it. And over time, each of these relationships leaves a wound. Small at first, then deeper still. A does what empaths always do in the beginning. She gives more. She tries harder. She tells herself the problem is that she hasn't given enough yet. Empaths aren't broken. They're alchemists in progress. The Alchemist's Path gives you drills, Jung-based boundaries, and 3 exclusive chapter videos to turn overwhelm into clarity. By Surreal Mind, 236-page downloadable ebook in stock. Begin now at thesurrealmind.com. Hasn't loved them the right way yet. But the wounds don't heal. They layer. And one day, without warning, something inside A goes quiet. It is not dramatic. There is no explosion, no breakdown, no moment of, "I've had enough." It is more like a door closing very softly. A sense of stillness where there used to be urgent concern. A growing awareness that she cannot feel the pull toward others the way she used to. She still loves. She still cares. But the compulsive need to run toward the pain of others, the reflex that used to feel as automatic as breathing, is no longer there. And A doesn't know whether to feel relieved or terrified by its absence. What A is experiencing is the beginning of the transformation. And it is happening for a reason that is deeply tied to her psychological survival. When an empath is hurt repeatedly, the mind begins to build something. Think of it less like walls and more like filters. Psychologists would describe this as the development of stronger emotional regulation, which is simply the brain's growing ability to manage and direct emotional responses rather than just having them happen to you. Because walls are rigid, they keep everything out. What the empath's mind actually constructs is far smarter than that. It starts to develop the ability to choose, to select, to decide consciously, sometimes for the first time in their lives, where their emotional energy actually goes. They begin to develop what we could call emotional judgment, a real ability to decide who is worth opening up to. And this is one of the most misunderstood parts of the whole transformation. People on the outside often see this phase and label it as the empath becoming cold. They say things like, "You used to be so warm," or "I don't know what happened to you, you've changed." And they are right that a change has happened. But cold is not the full picture. Psychologists often identify this stage as a period of compassion fatigue, or what is sometimes called depersonalization, where the brain temporarily mutes its emotional responses to outside signals as a way of recovering from chronic overstimulation. It is not a character flaw, it is a biological defense. What is happening underneath it is something more like the empath finally beginning to reclaim their ability to feel on their own terms. They are learning, often for the first time, that their emotional energy belongs to them, that they get to decide who receives it and who does not. Here is the part that almost nobody warns the empath about before it happens. The very change that is saving them is also going to feel, for a while, like losing the most important part of who they are. The early stages of this transformation are often deeply uncomfortable. There is grief involved, real, genuine grief, because the empath is losing something that was a core part of their identity. For many empaths, their openness, their sensitivity, their willingness to feel deeply on behalf of others was not just something they did. It was who they were. It was how they knew themselves. So when that reflex starts to quiet down, when they notice that they are no longer rushing to absorb the emotions around them, there is often a period of mourning, a sense of, who am I if I am not the person who feels everything? This is one of the most misunderstood stages of the empath's transformation, and it is also one of the most important. Because in that question, who am I if not this, lies the entire foundation of what they are about to become. The answer that slowly begins to emerge is not a comforting one, at least not at first. Because the answer is, you are someone you have never fully met before. Someone who exists independently of the needs, and emotions of others. Someone who has a self that is not defined by what other people are feeling or needing at any given moment. That realization, as liberating as it eventually becomes, often hits the empath like a kind of quiet devastation before it becomes a freedom. Let's bring in another lens here, because understanding the psychological mechanics of this transformation helps explain why it unfolds the way it does. There is a concept in psychology about the way we project parts of ourselves outward onto other people. An empath, by nature, does a version of this in reverse. Instead of projecting their own traits onto others, they absorb others' experiences as if they were their own. They lose the boundary between your feeling and my feeling. Over time, especially when those feelings are consistently painful ones, the psyche begins to compensate. It begins to demand that boundary back. It begins to insist, through fatigue, through numbness, through the gradual withdrawal of that outward flowing energy, that the empath draw a line between themselves and the rest of the world. This is not a failure of empathy. This is the mind protecting itself. This is the system doing exactly what it is designed to do: survive. And here is the part that most people never talk about, the part that makes this transformation genuinely extraordinary, rather than simply sad. What happens to all that energy once it stops flowing outward? And that redirected energy, the same energy we talked about earlier that stopped flowing outward, does not just sit still once it turns. It finds a new purpose. The same sensitivity that once made the empath a sponge for the pain of others starts to turn into a much sharper awareness of their own inner world. The same depth of perception that allowed them to read a room, to feel the unspoken tension in a group, to sense when someone was hurting even before they said a word, that same depth begins to turn inward and light up the empath's own inner world with extraordinary clarity. Many empaths in this phase report experiences that feel almost like waking up for the first time, like suddenly being able to hear their own voice after years of it being drowned out by everyone else's noise. They begin to notice their own desires, not in relation to other people, not as a response to what someone else needs, but as genuine self-generated wants. What do I actually enjoy? What do I find interesting when no one else's preference is influencing me? What does my inner life look like when I give it my full attention? For some empaths, these questions feel completely foreign, because the honest answer is that they have never asked them before. They have always oriented themselves according to others, always used other people as the compass, and now the compass is being recalibrated for the very first time to point inward. Let's look at a narrative illustration, a composite based on observed patterns rather than any single real case, to show what this looks like in practice. Consider the profile of someone we'll call M, who spent years in relationships where his role was always the same: the stable one, the calm one, the one who held things together. He was drawn to people who struggled, people who needed someone strong, and he gave that strength freely and without thinking. He was proud of it, actually. It felt like a purpose, until the day it didn't. Until the day he sat alone after another relationship ended the same way the last three had, with him having given everything and come out of it hollowed out, and he asked himself a question he had never dared ask before. What do I need? Not what does she need? Not what do they need from me? What do I need? Psychologists call this kind of shift cognitive reframing, and it is one of the most powerful tools the human mind has. It is the moment where a person consciously changes the lens they are looking through. For M, asking that question for the first time was not just a thought. It was a turning point. What M encountered in that silence was not emptiness. It was his own self, waiting quietly, having been patient for years. And the process of getting to know that self, of turning toward his own inner landscape after years of facing outward, was the beginning of the most important change of his life. This is the point in the empath's journey where something critical shifts in terms of their relationship with other people. And I want to be very clear about this because it is easy to misread what happens next as the empath becoming selfish or self-absorbed. What actually happens is much more interesting than that. As the empath begins to develop a stronger relationship with themselves, their pattern of relating to others starts to change in a fundamental way. They begin to relate from a place of choice rather than compulsion. The difference between those two things is everything. When you show up for someone out of compulsion, out of a fear of what happens if you don't, out of a need to feel needed, out of a pattern so old and automatic you don't even question it, you are not truly present in that interaction. You are just running a program. But when you show up for someone out of genuine choice, out of a true desire to give, rather than a fear-based need to, the quality of that presence is entirely different. It is cleaner, it is more honest, it is more powerful. Empaths who have gone through this transformation often describe something that sounds almost contradictory at first. They feel less connected to more people, but more deeply connected to fewer people. The net outreach narrows, but the quality of what remains deepens considerably. The relationships that survive the transformation, the ones that the empath actively chooses to keep, rather than just maintaining out of habit or obligation, tend to become the most honest and nourishing connections of their lives. And then there is this. The self-awareness that develops during this period is not just about understanding how they relate to others. It is also about understanding why. And this is where the transformation takes on an almost investigative quality. Because once an empath starts looking honestly at the patterns that led them here, once they start asking the harder questions about why they consistently chose people who took more than they gave, why they found meaning in being needed rather than being truly loved, why they struggled to say no, even when saying yes was slowly draining them of everything they had. Once they start sitting with those questions without flinching, the answers that come back are profound. Many empaths discover in this process that their sensitivity was never fully their own choice, that it developed partly as a survival strategy in earlier life, a way of reading environments and people quickly, of anticipating needs before they became demands, of keeping the peace by absorbing tension rather than letting it erupt. The gift and the wound were, for many of them, the same thing from the very beginning. The sensitivity that made them extraordinary connectors was also the sensitivity that made them particularly vulnerable to certain kinds of harm. And understanding that is transformative in a way that cannot be overstated. Because it means this: the transformation is not just about protection. It is not just about building better defenses. It is about finally understanding the full story of who you are. It is about taking that extraordinary capacity for depth and feeling and understanding, and extending it finally, completely, to yourself. Now here is where the story takes its most dramatic turn. There comes a moment in many empaths' transformation, and I call it a moment, but it is really more of a threshold, where the shift becomes foundational, where something clicks into place that makes it much harder and far less desirable to go back to the self-sacrificing patterns of the past. This threshold looks different for different people, and not everyone arrives at it the same way or at the same time. For some, it comes after a specific event, a final betrayal, a relationship that leaves them so depleted that the body itself says, enough. For others, it comes more quietly. A slow recognition one morning that they have not thought about someone else's problems in days, that they have been living inside their own life rather than existing on the edges of other people's lives, and that it feels, for the first time in years, sustainable. Consider a composite case profile drawn from patterns observed across many different experiences of someone we'll call TT, was the kind of person who had always been described by others as a lighthouse. People were drawn to her in darkness. She had an extraordinary ability to make people feel understood, to sit with them in their pain without flinching, to offer a kind of presence that most people spend their whole lives searching for. And she gave it freely, to almost everyone who needed it, for most of her adult life. Like the empath pattern we described earlier, she kept pouring out, while very little came back in. She told herself it was just the cost of caring deeply, that one day the people she gave so much to would give it back. They didn't, not because they were all terrible people. Many of them had simply grown so used to T always showing up that they stopped noticing the effort it took. They never asked whether she was okay, because she never let on that she wasn't. And T, for her part, had always hidden it well, because that is what empaths do, until they can't. The threshold for T came not with anger, not with tears, but with something she described as a kind of deep cellular exhaustion, a tiredness that sat in her bones, a quiet, absolute knowledge that she could not go on the way she had been going. And in that moment of bone-deep knowing, something in her stopped. Not her love for others, not her capacity for connection, but her willingness to give without receiving, her tolerance for imbalance, her readiness to accept the bare minimum that some people offered in return and call it enough. Something in her very quietly said, no more. And that was the beginning of T's real life. Because what came after that threshold was not bitterness, even though she had every right to it. What came after was something far more valuable. It was clarity. It was the ability to look at a person or a relationship or a situation and ask, with genuine authority, does this serve me? Not in a cold or transactional way, not in a way that erased her warmth or her generosity, but in a way that finally, for the first time, included herself in the equation. This is the phase of the transformation that people on the outside almost always misread. They see the empath pulling back and they think something has been lost. And in a way, they are right. Something has been lost. The version of the empath who gave endlessly, who held the door open to everyone regardless of how they were treated, who made themselves small so others could feel large, that version is gone. But what has arrived in its place is not less, it is more, it is fuller, it is more complete. The empath who has come through this transformation is, in many ways, the most emotionally aware person in any room they walk into, because they carry two kinds of knowledge that most people never develop at the same time. They understand what it means to feel deeply, not just for themselves, but in genuine connection with others, because that capacity never leaves. But they also understand now how to be the guardian of that capacity, how to direct it, how to protect it, how to use it in ways that build rather than deplete. They become someone who is not just empathically talented, but empathically wise. And that wisdom shows up in tangible, specific ways. It shows up in how they handle conflict. Where the unhealed empath used to absorb conflict, take on the emotional weight of every disagreement, bend themselves into knots trying to smooth over tensions that were not theirs to smooth. The transformed empath approaches conflict differently. They can hold space for difficulty without dissolving into it. They can listen without losing themselves. They can disagree without turning every disagreement into a disaster in their head. They can say, "This is not okay with me," without the crushing guilt that used to follow those words like a shadow. It shows up in the relationships they choose. The transformed empath is extraordinarily good at recognizing, early, the patterns that used to cost them so much. The person who takes more than they give, the relationship that only functions when the empath is in service mode, the friendship that only calls when it needs something. These patterns, which once felt invisible because they were simply part of how things had always worked, now stand out with immediate clarity. And the transformed empath trusts that clarity. They act on it, not out of coldness, but out of hard-won self-knowledge. It shows up in their inner life. The transformed empath has, through this entire process, developed a relationship with their own inner world that is remarkably rich. The inward turn that began as a survival mechanism has become a genuine source of strength. They know themselves. They know their patterns. They know what they need and what they don't. They have sat with the hardest questions about why they are the way they are, and they have come through those questions with something real on the other side, and it shows up in their capacity for genuine compassion, which, strangely enough, is deeper and more grounded after the transformation than before. Because before, their empathy was sometimes impossible to tell apart from anxiety, from the desperate need to fix and soothe and absorb, from a compulsion to make pain go away in others and in themselves. After the transformation, their compassion comes from a different place, from abundance rather than anxiety, from genuine care rather than compulsive need. They can be moved by someone's pain without being destroyed by it. They can choose to help without being unable not to. That is a profoundly different kind of empathy, and it is, in many ways, a more powerful one. But I want to acknowledge something here, because it would not be honest to talk about this transformation without talking about what it costs. The cost is real. It is not just the grief of losing an old identity, though that is part of it. It is the discomfort of changing patterns that have been in place for years, sometimes decades. It is the awkwardness of learning to ask for what you need when you have spent your whole life asking what others need. It is the loneliness of pulling back from relationships that were built on an unhealthy dynamic. Because when you stop playing the role you always played, some people don't know what to do with you. Some of them leave. And even when their leaving is the right outcome, it still hurts. Even when you know, in your clearest moments, that what you had was not true connection, but a transaction dressed up in the language of love, the ending of it still leaves a mark. The transformed empath has to sit with that loss, has to resist the pull to go back to the familiar dynamic just to relieve the discomfort, has to learn to tolerate the space that opens up when they are no longer filling every moment with someone else's needs. That space can feel enormous, and in the beginning, it often feels more like emptiness than like freedom. But here is what I want you to hear clearly if you are somewhere in the middle of this process right now. The space is not emptiness. It is capacity. It is the room that had to be cleared before something real could grow there. There is a particular kind of courage required during this phase that most people underestimate. It is not the dramatic, visible courage of someone making a grand gesture or walking away from something loudly. It is the quieter, harder courage of sitting still in your own discomfort and refusing to run from it, of letting the old version of yourself fall away without immediately trying to replace it with something new, of trusting that the stillness is not the end of something, but the ground floor of something better. Many empaths in this stage of the transformation describe feeling profoundly out of place in their own lives for a period of time. The social roles that used to fit them no longer feel right. The ways they used to talk about themselves, as helpers, as fixers, as the ones people leaned on, those descriptions start to feel inadequate or even inaccurate. And that identity gap, that period where the old self has dissolved, but the new self has not yet fully formed, can be genuinely disorienting. It helps to understand that this disorientation is not a sign that something has gone wrong. It is a sign that the transformation is doing what transformations do. It is a sign that the process is real and that it is working. The empath in this stage would benefit enormously from one thing above all else: being witnessed by someone who understands what they are going through without trying to fix it or rush it, which is one of the great ironies of this entire journey. The person who spent years witnessing others, holding space for others, sitting patiently with others in their pain, now most needs exactly that kind of presence extended toward themselves, and learning to receive it, learning to allow themselves to be held rather than always being the one who holds, is itself one of the most important milestones of the entire transformation. Let me be direct with you for a moment, because I think this matters. If you clicked on this video today, there is a good chance that some part of what you have heard resonates with something you are living right now. Maybe you are in the early stages, feeling that first wave of exhaustion and wondering why caring about others is starting to feel less like a gift and more like a burden you never agreed to carry. Maybe you are in the middle stages, feeling the strangeness of the inward turn, the disorientation of getting to know a self you have long neglected. Or maybe you are further along, somewhere near that threshold, standing at the edge of a new way of being and not quite sure whether to trust it. Wherever you are, in this process, I want you to know something. This is not a breakdown. This is not you becoming someone less than who you were. This is, if you understand it for what it actually is, one of the most significant acts of growth a person can go through, because it requires you to hold two things at once that most people cannot hold: a profound capacity for feeling and an equally profound commitment to your own wholeness. The world needs empaths. It genuinely does. But it needs empaths who are whole. Empaths who give from a place of abundance rather than depletion. Empaths who understand the value of what they carry and protect it accordingly. Empaths who have done the hard work of turning inward, of sitting with the harder questions about themselves, of coming through the transformation and arriving on the other side as something more fully themselves. Because here is the truth that nobody talks about when they talk about empaths. The gift was never in the endless giving. The gift was in the depth of feeling, and that depth does not require depletion to exist. It does not require self-erasure. It does not require you to disappear into other people's needs in order to justify your own presence. The gift is still there after the transformation. It is just housed differently now. It lives in a person who has boundaries, in a person who chooses, in a person who has met themselves at their lowest and most depleted and decided, quietly but with absolute certainty, that they are worth protecting too. That is not the death of empathy. That is its full expression. That is what empathy looks like when it has finally been allowed to include the self. And if you are in the middle of that evolution right now, if you are somewhere in the confusing, uncomfortable, sometimes lonely process of becoming more fully yourself after years of being everyone else's everything, I want to say this to you plainly. Keep going. Trust the process even when it does not feel like growth. Trust the stillness even when it feels like loss. Trust the quieting of the old reflexes, even when it feels like you are becoming someone you do not yet recognize. Because the version of you that is emerging on the other side of this is not colder or harder or less capable of love. They are clearer. They are truer. They are more genuinely themselves than the person who gave until there was nothing left. The relationships that are real, the ones built on mutual care and genuine give and take, and honest seeing of each other, those relationships will not be threatened by who you are becoming. They will be deepened by it, because real connection does not require you to make yourself small. Real connection thrives when both people are fully, honestly present, and you cannot be fully, honestly present when you are disappearing into someone else's needs. So bring yourself back, all the way back. Not away from others, but toward yourself first, because the path to genuine connection with other people runs straight through the center of a genuine connection with who you are. That is the secret psychological transformation this video promised you. A coming home to a self that has been waiting quietly, patiently, for you to finally stop running toward everyone else long enough to feel your own ground beneath your feet. If this resonated with you today, I would love for you to leave a comment below. Tell me where you are in your own journey, whether you are just beginning to notice the shift, or whether you are standing on the other side, looking back at the road you have traveled. Your story matters here, and if even one line in this video gave you language for something you have been carrying without words, then this conversation was worth having. If this channel has given you something worth keeping, subscribing is the best way to make sure the next video finds its way to you. We put real thought and real care into everything we create. Here, because we believe this kind of understanding does not just inform you, it changes you. And we think it has changed something in you today, even just a little. We will see you in the next one. In The Alchemist's Path, perception training for empaths, you'll turn overwhelm into wisdom with practical drills, Jung-inspired boundaries, and step-by-step perception training. This guide includes 3 exclusive chapter videos to deepen each lesson. Written by Surreal Mind, 236 pages, beautifully designed 8.5 by 11 downloadable ebook, in stock now. Start your training today. Feel deeply while thinking clearly. Get The Alchemist's Path at thesurrealmind.com.